A blade, a scream that ends in silence, and a childhood that dies on an operating table so an empire can gain a servant who will never betray it. Before we go further into what happened in those palace chambers, like and subscribe to this channel. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people, because what the Ottomans did to create their most loyal servants is something most history books won't describe in full detail. But you're about to hear it all. Power has always demanded sacrifice. But sometimes, the sacrifice isn't volunteered. Sometimes, it's carved from the bodies of children who never had a choice. In the Ottoman Empire, there existed a class of men who stood closer to the Sultan than his own sons. They controlled treasuries, worth kingdoms. They commanded armies. They whispered in the ears of sultans and shaped policies that affected millions. These were the eunuchs, and their path to power began with a brutality so calculated, so systematically cruel, that it challenges everything we think we know about loyalty and control. They weren't born into servitude. They were made into it, one mutilation at a time. And the process that created them reveals something about the nature of empire that most of us would rather not confront. The procurement of boys destined for castration was itself a trade, conducted in markets from Cairo to Constantinople, with the casual efficiency of livestock dealing. Slave traders knew the specifications. Boys between the ages of 8 and 12, before puberty fully took hold. These weren't children plucked randomly from streets. Christian boys from the Balkans, taken through the devshirme system, where Ottoman officials would tour villages and select the most promising children from their families. African boys captured or purchased in the Horn of Ethiopia and Sudan, transported north along trade routes that had been moving human cargo for centuries. War captives, whose noble blood made them valuable for more than just labor. Some were sold by impoverished parents who believed palace service offered a better fate than starvation. They were all wrong about what awaited them. The boys arrived in cities like Istanbul or Cairo still intact, still possessing the basic anatomy of boyhood. They were examined like horses, their teeth checked, their bodies prodded for signs of disease or weakness, because the procedure they were about to undergo killed a significant percentage of them, and slave traders didn't profit from corpses. Only the healthiest, the strongest, the most likely to survive the brutality, were moved forward to the next stage. What happened next occurred in chambers that most people in the empire never saw and didn't want to imagine. The castration of boys for Ottoman service came in two forms, each with its own horrific logic. The first involved removal of the testicles only, leaving the penis intact. This created partial eunuchs, and while the procedure was agonizing and dangerous, the survival rate was somewhat higher than the alternative. But these men were considered less trustworthy for certain positions, still capable of sexual function even if they could not reproduce. The second form was total castration, the complete removal of external genitalia. This was what the palace demanded for those who would serve in the inner sanctums, who would have access to the harem, who would stand in rooms where the sultan's wives and concubines lived. The procedure was conducted by specialists whose expertise was the only thing standing between a boy and almost certain death. The child was held down, sometimes given wine or opium to dull the pain, though never enough to truly stop it. The cutting was done quickly with a curved blade, the wound cauterized with boiling oil or a red-hot iron, the screams absorbed by thick walls that had heard it all before. Then came the recovery, if you could call it that. The boy was buried in sand up to his waist, the heat meant to promote healing, but also serving to immobilize him during the crucial days that followed. He wasn't allowed to drink water for days, a deprivation meant to reduce urine output while the wound tried to close. Many boys died here, in the sand, from infection or shock, or the sheer physical trauma of what had been done to them. The survival rate for total castration hovered around 60 to 70%, according to some historical estimates. That meant 3 or 4 out of every 10 boys didn't make it past the first week. Their bodies were disposed of with minimal ceremony, and new boys were purchased to replace them. The ones who survived emerged into a new existence. Their voices, frozen at the pitch of boyhood, or taking on the strange high quality that marked them as eunuchs for life. Their bodies, unable to develop in the ways that testosterone would have driven, often growing tall and soft in proportion. They were marked forever, their childhood violently ended, their futures irrevocably altered by decisions made by men who saw them as raw material for an empire's machinery. Survival of the procedure was just the beginning. The young eunuchs entered a world of rigid hierarchy within the palace walls. At the bottom were the newly castrated boys, learning to navigate bodies that no longer worked the way they once had, dealing with incontinence and chronic pain that some never fully escaped. They were trained in various skills depending on their intelligence. Reading, writing, court etiquette, the languages spoken in the empire, religious texts that legitimized Ottoman rule. Their education was often superior to what they would have received in their villages of origin, a fact that the empire's defenders would cite as evidence of benevolence, as if education could compensate for mutilation. The eunuchs who served in the harem occupied a unique position. They moved freely through spaces where no intact man except the Sultan himself could enter. They carried messages, supervised servants, maintained order among hundreds of women who lived in a world within a world. The chief black eunuch, the Kislar Aga, became one of the most powerful figures in the entire Ottoman state. He controlled the harem, but also the extensive estates that funded it, the appointments of provincial governors, the flow of information between the Sultan and his mother or wives. Men who had been castrated as boys in African villages rose to command wealth and influence that eclipsed most nobles born to privilege. But this power came wrapped in layers of bitter irony. They could accumulate wealth but had no children to inherit it. They wielded influence but were never seen as fully human by the society they served. They were trusted precisely because they had been made incapable of betrayal, their loyalty purchased through the destruction of possibilities. And underneath whatever success they achieved ran the constant awareness of what had been taken from them, the phantom sensations of parts that no longer existed, the knowledge that their bodies had been sacrificed for an empire's convenience. The genius of the system, if we can use such a word for something so monstrous, lay in its psychological architecture. The Ottoman Empire didn't just remove the physical capacity for reproduction. It created an entire class of men whose very existence depended on the continuation of the system that had mutilated them. A eunuch outside the palace structure had few options. In most of the empire's territories, they were objects of pity or disgust. Their best chance at survival, at dignity, at any form of power, lay within the very institution that had destroyed their childhoods. This created loyalty more absolute than anything mere ideology or religion could generate. A eunuch who betrayed the Sultan wasn't just risking execution. He was risking a return to meaninglessness, to a world that saw him as less than a man. The palace became their entire universe because the empire had made sure they could never truly belong anywhere else. Their interests were perfectly aligned with institutional stability because they had nowhere else to go. The castration hadn't made them saints. It had made them survivors in a system that rewarded cunning and punished weakness. Not every eunuch made peace with what had been done to him. The sources are fragmentary, but they exist. References to eunuchs who fell into depression so deep that food lost all appeal. Accounts of suicides. Men who gained access to the highest chambers of power, only to one day open their veins in rooms that overlooked the Bosphorus. One account mentions a young eunuch who had been captured as a boy from a Greek village, castrated in Cairo, and brought to Istanbul, where his intelligence caught attention. He rose through the ranks with unusual speed, but something in him never adjusted. He would stand for hours, staring at families in the street below the palace walls, watching fathers with sons. One morning he was found dead in his quarters, poison in his cup, a letter beside him written in Greek that no one could read. The letter was destroyed, unread, considered too dangerous to preserve. These stories remind us that beneath the titles and the influence were men who remembered being boys, who had phantom memories of futures that were stolen before they could be lived. The system tried to make them forget, tried to replace their stolen possibilities with palace intrigues and bureaucratic power. For some, it worked. For others, the wound never healed. The Ottoman Empire ended in the early 20th century. The palace eunuchs found themselves suddenly obsolete. The harems were disbanded, the old power structures dismantled, and these men, who had been created to serve an empire that no longer existed, had to find ways to survive in a world that had moved on. Some lived in poverty. Others managed to preserve enough wealth to live out their days in quiet obscurity. Almost all of them took their stories to the grave. We remember the Ottoman Empire for its architecture, its conquests, its contributions to art and military strategy. But we tend to gloss over the human cost of maintaining that power, the specific bodies that were broken to keep the machine running. The eunuchs were just one example, but they were a vivid one. They represented the empire's willingness to do whatever was necessary, to brutalize children if it served the interests of stability and control. The boys who died during or after the castration procedure never got monuments. The ones who survived and served, even those who rose to incredible power, were still fundamentally prisoners of what had been done to them. Walk through the Topkapi Palace today, and you can see the quarters where the eunuchs lived. Tour guides mention them in passing, usually focusing on the chief eunuchs who wielded such unusual power. What they rarely describe in detail is how those men became eunuchs in the first place. The castration chambers aren't preserved or marked. The boys who didn't survive aren't commemorated. The system that fed children into a machine of mutilation for 500 years gets reduced to a few sentences, but it deserves more than that. The boys who were castrated for Ottoman service didn't choose that fate. They were selected, purchased, mutilated, and transformed into something the empire needed them to be. Their story is part of the Ottoman legacy as much as the beautiful mosques and the military victories, and it's a story worth remembering in full, with all its brutality intact, because that's the only way we can honestly reckon with what empire actually means, what it actually costs, and who actually pays.